They said she was just a clerk. Never deployed, never fought. Just sat behind a desk and wore a uniform like it was borrowed. But when the Admiral walked in and saw the faded ink above her wrist, a call sign most officers weren't cleared to know, he didn't ask questions. He said one word, and the entire room went silent. Because that mark wasn't decoration, it was a warning, and they'd spent the whole morning mocking it. Want to know what he said and why everything changed after? Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Let's begin. The overhead fluorescence in Wing C hummed with that persistent buzz that becomes part of your breathing after a few years on base. Outside, the Virginia dawn painted the tarmac in shades of copper and shadow, while inside the administrative corridors of Naval Station Norfolk, the day's controlled chaos was already building toward the morning briefings. By 0700, the Operations Scheduling Center pulsed with the familiar rhythm of military efficiency. Junior personnel moved between terminals like chess pieces, updating flight manifests, cross-referencing tail numbers, inputting clearance codes for the dozen sorties scheduled before noon. Coffee percolated in the corner machine, filling the air with that bitter government blend that somehow tasted exactly the same on every base from San Diego to Norfolk. The smell, mixed with printer toner, floor wax, and the faint metallic scent of electronics running hard. The Admiral's inspection was due in less than 2 hours. You could feel the tension in the way keyboards clicked a little faster, the way conversations stayed clipped and professional, the way everyone moved with purpose but tried not to look like they were rushing. Near the far wall, stationed at Terminal 3 beside a bank of flight status monitors, a woman worked in quiet isolation. Mid-40s, maybe older, with the kind of weathered calm that comes from years of watching younger people panic over problems that have simple solutions. Her hair was short, practical, showing gray at the temples, no rank displayed anywhere, just a laminated clerk badge hanging from a blue lanyard, the plastic worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. Her name tag read Voss Erin. She moved through the manifest system like water, finding its level, smooth, efficient, never hurried. No reference sheets scattered across her desk, no sticky notes covering her monitor, just steady data entry at a pace that suggested muscle memory. Like her fingers knew these systems better than she knew her own reflection. 3 other personnel had taken notice, forming a loose cluster around the central workstation where they could talk without being overheard by the duty officer. Lieutenant Junior Grade Rains was the unofficial leader. Tall, confident, with the kind of smile that suggested he'd never met a regulation he couldn't charm his way around. Fresh from officer candidate school, with opinions about everything and experience with very little, Petty Officer Halley leaned against the counter beside him, pecking at his keyboard with 2 fingers while keeping one eye on the conversation. Navy for 3 years, just long enough to think he understood how things worked. The kind of sailor who knew every shortcut and assumed that made him smarter than everyone else. Chief Petty Officer Dorsey completed the trio. Older than the other 2, but no less eager to join in if the joke was safe enough. He'd been Navy for 15 years, long enough to spot the easy targets and avoid the dangerous ones. Or so he thought. Rains tilted his head toward Erin, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by his audience. Ever notice how she's always here? Like she's part of the furniture. Swear I've seen that same pullover every quarter since I got posted. Halley chuckled, not bothering to lower his voice. She's like a filing cabinet that grew legs, just exists to process paperwork. Office fixture, Dorsey added, clicking through his own terminal. Been here forever. Never moves up, never moves out. Rains warmed to his theme, enjoying the attention. Bet she's been an E4 since the Clinton administration. Mastered Excel sometime around 2003 and decided that was enough adventure for one career. Erin didn't turn, Didn't pause in her typing, just kept entering tail numbers with the same steady rhythm as if their conversation was happening in another room, in another building, in another life entirely. But the young ensign at the adjacent terminal glanced over, his brow furrowing slightly as he watched her work. Something about her speed was unusual. Not frantic or show-offy, just unnaturally smooth. Like watching someone play a piano piece they'd memorized years ago. Hallie pushed back from his desk and wandered closer to Aaron's station, emboldened by the quiet laughter behind him. "Hey, we were thinking of grabbing some coffee from the officers' lounge upstairs. You want to be a hero and fetch a round for the working folks?" The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, a test disguised as a favor, a way to establish the hierarchy, to confirm what everyone already assumed about where she fit in the food chain. Erin's fingers paused on the keyboard. She turned in her chair just enough to meet his eyes, not challenging, not angry, just present. When she spoke, her voice was flat as desert wind. "I don't take orders from people who can't finish their own job tickets." The response landed like a slap. Simple. Director. Completely without heat, which somehow made it cut deeper. Hallie blinked, his confident smirk flickering like a bad connection. Behind him, Dorsey suddenly found his clipboard fascinating. Rain straightened slightly, unsure whether to escalate or retreat. "Touchy," Rains muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Probably just frustrated she never earned a deployment ribbon. Hallie recovered his balance, pulling authority around himself like armor. Honestly, I bet she's never even left the continental United States. Her whole career probably fits inside a single manila folder. Dorsey laughed. Too quickly, too loudly. "She's a paper warrior, boys. All signature, no story. Probably thinks combat is when the printer jams during a deadline." The words settled into the space around them, casual and cutting. This kind of dismissal that happens 1,000 times a day in 1,000 offices. So routine, it barely registers as cruelty. Erin absorbed it without response. She turned back to her terminal, her fingers resuming their steady dance across the keys, as if the conversation had never happened. As if these three men and their opinions mattered exactly as much as the background hum of the fluorescent lights. But across the room, the young ensign was still watching her work. His frown deepened as he noticed the speed and precision of her data entry, the way she navigated between systems without hesitation, the fact that she never seemed to reference any documentation or cheat sheets. His supervisor, a grizzled petty officer named Martinez, who'd been running terminals since before computers had color screens, drifted over to see what had caught the kid's attention. "Something wrong with your station, Collins?" Ensign Collins shook his head slowly. "No, sir. Just watching her work. Is it normal to process manifests that fast?" Martinez followed his gaze to Erin's station, watching her fingers move across the keyboard in smooth, efficient patterns. After a moment, he shrugged. "Some people know their job better than others," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, "and some people's jobs aren't what they appear to be." He walked away before Collins could ask what that meant, leaving the young officer to puzzle over the cryptic comment while Rains, Hallie, and Dorsey continued their casual character assassination from across the room. The morning rolled forward with typical military precision. Duty rosters updated, flight schedules confirmed, coffee consumed in measured doses to maintain alertness without triggering jitters during the Admiral's inspection. The three-man comedy show gradually dispersed to their respective stations, their entertainment value exhausted. Erin remained where she was, processing data with mechanical consistency, invisible in the way that truly competent people often become. So reliable that their competence becomes part of the background, taken for granted like gravity or air conditioning. Then the system crashed. It started small, the way disasters often do. A young petty officer at the communications hub noticed his clearance requests weren't going through. Simple denials, nothing unusual. But then another tech reported the same problem. Then another. Within 10 minutes, the entire drone dispatch queue had ground to a halt. $60 million worth of unmanned aircraft assets sat in digital limbo, their pre-flight authorizations trapped in some bureaucratic black hole that nobody could identify, much less fix. The kind of problem that turns routine inspections into career-ending catastrophes. Dorsey found himself pulled into the growing crisis cluster around the main communications console, watching a series of increasingly frustrated technicians try to diagnose the failure. Red error messages blinked across multiple screens like Christmas lights at a car accident. Still showing rejected, muttered the lead tech, a second-class petty officer whose expertise was being tested in real time. I've run the override sequence 3 times. Something's blocking the authorization protocol. Hallie joined the group, drawn by the scent of someone else's impending doom. What's the error code saying? That's the problem, the tech replied, pointing at a string of alphanumeric gibberish scrolling across his monitor. It's throwing back legacy authentication flags that shouldn't even exist anymore. A senior chief arrived, coffee in hand, expression shifting from casual interest to controlled alarm as he assessed the situation. How long until the Admiral gets here? 90 minutes, Dorsey answered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Fix it, the senior chief said flatly. However you have to. This isn't happening on my watch. The circle of technicians huddled closer around the console, voices rising slightly as solutions were proposed, tested, and discarded. Someone suggested calling the IT help desk. Someone else pointed out that the help desk wouldn't open for another hour. A third person began calculating how long it would take to manually reset every system in the network, a process that might take the rest of the day. Erin rose from her station and walked over to the group, not rushing, not pushing through, just moving with the same measured pace she'd maintained all morning. Let me see the error sequence, she said quietly. Hallie turned, his face showing a mixture of surprise and irritation. Sorry, this isn't a scheduling problem. We're dealing with encrypted authorization protocols here. Yeah, Dorsey added, not bothering to look at her. No offense, Voss, but this is above your clearance level. We need someone who understands the back-end security architecture. Erin stood behind them, patient as stone, waiting for the dismissal to finish. When they'd exhausted their polite ways of telling her to go back to her desk, she spoke again. Your rejection codes are legacy authentication flags from the Cold Echo Protocol series, pre-2011 architecture. The system's reading your authorization requests as potential spoofing attempts. The lead tech paused his frantic typing and turned to look at her. Come again? She pointed to the scrolling error codes on his monitor. Those prefix identifiers were used for overseas drone coordination before the security overhaul. The authentication system got updated, but some of the back-end verification protocols still reference the old encryption trees. When you try to process modern clearance requests through a system that's looking for deprecated authentication signatures, it kicks back security warnings. The senior chief frowned. How do you know that? Instead of answering, Erin stepped forward and reached for the keyboard. May I? The tech hesitated, looking to the senior chief for guidance. After a moment's consideration, the senior chief nodded. Erin's fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision. 3 lines of code, typed faster than most people could write their names. Commands that bypassed the authentication loop. Rerouted the verification protocols, and pointed the system toward the correct security framework. She hit execute. The screen flashed once, paused for a heartbeat, then cleared. New text appeared. Authorization queue restored. 47 pending requests processed. System nominal. Around the console, 6 people stared at the monitor in silence. The red error messages had vanished. The drone dispatch queue was flowing again. $60 million worth of aircraft had just been rescued from digital purgatory. The lead tech turned to stare at Aaron. How did you... The system architecture was designed with backward compatibility safeguards, she said simply. Sometimes they conflict with modern protocols. You just have to know which bridges to burn. Hallie's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But how did you have override authorization for those command levels? Aaron didn't answer. She was already walking back to her station, her part in the crisis apparently concluded. Dorsey looked at the senior chief. Did she just fix our entire network? The senior chief was staring at Aaron's retreating figure with a strange expression, part surprise, part recognition, part something else entirely. Collins, he called to the young ensign who'd been watching the whole thing. Pull up the user authorization logs for Terminal 3. I want to see what clearance levels are associated with that workstation. Collins's fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing system files that most people never thought to check. After a moment, his face went pale. Senior Chief, he said quietly, you need to see this. The senior chief moved behind Collins's chair and read over his shoulder. His expression shifted through several stages of disbelief before settling into something like awe. Shh, Jesus Christ, he whispered. What is it? Dorsey asked, but the senior chief was already moving away from the console, pulling his phone from his pocket, dialing a number he'd hoped never to use. Across the room, Erin had returned to her quiet work, processing manifests with the same steady rhythm that had marked her entire morning. But now, instead of being invisible, she had become the center of a growing sphere of uncomfortable attention. People glanced at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Conversations paused when she walked past. The easy dismissal of the early morning had been replaced by something much more complicated. In 15 minutes, Admiral Calhoun would arrive for his inspection, and when he did, the comfortable assumptions that had governed the morning would be swept away, like sandcastles at high tide. But Erin Voss continued her work, patient as always, carrying secrets that 3 junior officers were about to discover they had never been cleared to know. The corridor outside operations fell quiet with that particular silence that precedes authority. Then came the sound of polished shoes on polished floors, the crisp murmur of voices announcing movement through the building's arteries. Admiral Calhoun arrived like weather, inevitable, unmistakable, changing the pressure in every room he entered. 65 years old, with the kind of bearing that came from commanding ships in actual combat, not just training exercises. His uniform was pressed to geometric precision, ribbons arranged in neat rows that told stories of deployments to places that didn't appear on tourist maps. But it wasn't the decorations that people noticed first. It was the way conversation stopped when he walked past. The way junior officers found urgent business elsewhere. The way the air itself seemed to come to attention. Admiral on deck, someone announced, though everyone had already felt his presence. He returned the scattered salutes with a brief nod and continued his measured progress through operations, pausing at workstations to ask pointed questions about readiness levels, system status, and personnel assignments. His inspection style was efficient rather than harsh. He'd been doing this long enough to spot problems without creating new ones. Rains, Hallie, and Dorsey formed up with the other personnel, watching the Admiral work his way through the department. They'd survived the drone crisis by staying invisible, while Aaron fixed what they couldn't, and now they just wanted to get through the inspection without drawing attention to their earlier incompetence. But Admiral Calhoun had stopped moving. He stood near the center of the room, his gaze fixed on something that had caught his attention. Slowly, his head turned toward Terminal 3, where Erin sat with her clipboard and pen, quietly updating a sortie checklist as if nothing unusual had happened. His expression shifted. Surprise, recognition. Something that might have been pleasure crossing his weathered features like sunlight, breaking through clouds. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. The Admiral moved toward Aaron's station, shaking his head in what looked like amazement. "Now there's a face I never thought I'd see in this wing again." Every person in operations felt the shift in the room's gravity. Conversations died. Keyboards fell silent. Rains exchanged a panicked glance with Hallie. Since when did admirals know clerks by sight? Aaron looked up from her paperwork with the same calm expression she'd worn all morning. No surprise, no excitement, just acknowledgement. "Admiral," she said simply. Calhoun's face broke into something that was almost a grin. "Still know how to fix a broken authentication system faster than my entire IT department, I see." The words hit the room like a depth charge. Dorsey felt his stomach drop into his boots. Hallie's face drained of color. Rains realized, with growing horror, that they might have made a mistake. A very, very large mistake. Admiral Calhoun turned to face the assembled personnel, his expression shifting from warmth to something considerably colder. "You all been giving her a hard time this morning?" The silence stretched like a wire under tension. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even breathing seemed like it might be a bad idea. Rains cleared his throat, trying to project confidence he no longer felt. "Sir, we just didn't know she was—" "Of course you didn't," Calhoun cut him off, his voice carrying the kind of authority that ended discussions before they started. "You didn't ask." He looked at each of them in turn, Rains, Hallie, Dorsey, his gaze lingering long enough to make them deeply uncomfortable with their life choices. "You ever hear the call sign Ghost Echo 6? 3 blank stares answered him. The rest of the room maintained its breathless silence. "Didn't think so," Calhoun said, a note of disappointment creeping into his voice. "That's her call sign. Or was, once upon a time." He gestured toward Aaron, who had returned to her paperwork, as if she weren't the center of a career-defining moment for 3 junior officers. "Let me tell you something about the person you've been dismissing all morning," the Admiral continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "You see a clerk. I see the reason 2 of our satellites are still in orbit." Hallie felt his knees go weak. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of mistake. "You think you're clever with your clearance codes and your dispatch protocols?" Calhoun looked directly at Hallie, who wished desperately that he could disappear. "Son, she used to reroute Blackbird reconnaissance flights while you were still figuring out how to spell cybersecurity." Aaron continued writing, her pen moving across the checklist with mechanical precision. If she was enjoying this reversal of fortune, she gave no sign of it. "You ever hear of the Malacca Strait incident?" Calhoun asked the room at large. A few heads shook. Most people just stared. "Singapore, 2004, 2 nuclear submarines, 1 American, 1 Australian, scheduled to transit the same corridor during monsoon season. Navcom made a routing error. Similar acoustic signatures, overlapping patrol schedules. You know what happens when 2 nuclear submarines pass within a half-mile of each other while running silent?" Nobody answered, but the implications hung in the air like smoke. "Collision, deep water. 2 governments pointing fingers while 24 sailors become statistics. International incident, congressional hearings. The kind of mistake that ends careers and starts wars." He paused to let that sink in. "You know who caught the routing conflict and corrected it?" The room remained silent, but every eye was now fixed on Aaron, who continued her paperwork as if the conversation were happening on another planet. She spotted the overlap in a routine data stream and made a 2-minute course correction that saved 24 lives, and nobody even knew it happened. Rains felt sweat gathering at his collar. This couldn't be real. The quiet woman with the faded badge and the 10-year-old pullover couldn't have. You think she's furniture? Calhoun's voice rose slightly, cutting through Raines's internal protests. She was the Navy's primary signals intelligence analyst for 15 years. They built systems around her expertise. Half of CENTCOM's communication architecture exists because she designed the protocols when everyone else was still using paper maps and prayer. Dorsey's mouth had gone completely dry. He tried to remember exactly what he'd said earlier, how dismissive he'd been, how casual his contempt had sounded. Then why is she here? Hallie managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Like this? Admiral Calhoun finally turned to look at Aaron directly, his expression softening into something like respect. She's here because she earned the right to be anywhere she wants to be. She's quiet because she's carried responsibility that would crush most people, and she doesn't owe anyone in this room an explanation for how she chooses to serve. The Admiral walked closer to Aaron's workstation, and that's when people noticed what they'd missed before. The sleeve of her pullover had shifted slightly, revealing a small section of her left wrist. There, in ink so dark it seemed to absorb light, was a geometric pattern that wasn't quite a tattoo in any traditional sense. 4 letters embedded in static-like fractals, invisible unless you knew what to look for. Ghost Echo 6, Calhoun said quietly. That's not a vanity call sign. That's a designation you don't speak aloud unless you've seen what it represents. That mark used to be classified. Required UV light to read properly. He turned back to face the room, his voice carrying new weight. She didn't just process intelligence. She intercepted hostile transmissions in real time, rerouted compromised communications, ghosted entire operations before enemy forces knew they'd been detected. I once watched her abort a mission because something in the authentication sequence felt wrong. Just 2 characters out of place in a 40-digit code. Later found out the transmission had been spoofed by a Chinese listening post. She saved 83 lives that day, and nobody clapped. The silence in the room was no longer expectant. It was reverent, the kind of quiet that follows revelation, when people realize they've been standing in the presence of something they never recognized. Dorsey stared at his shoes. Hallie found himself unable to swallow. Raines felt like he was drowning in his own uniform. So, maybe next time, Admiral Calhoun said, his voice returning to normal volume but losing none of its authority. Before you decide someone doesn't matter, you might want to ask who they really are. He stepped closer to Hallie, who looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Son, you got anything to say to Ghost Echo 6? Hallie's mouth moved soundlessly for a moment before he managed to croak out. We didn't know, sir. No, Calhoun agreed. You didn't. And you didn't bother to find out. The Admiral turned to Aaron, his tone shifting to something warmer, more personal. Permission to speak candidly, Ghost? Aaron looked up from her paperwork and gave him a small, genuine smile. The first real expression she'd shown all morning. Always, Admiral. Still keeping the watch? Someone has to, she replied quietly. Calhoun nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. Then he turned back to the room at large. Carry on, he said simply. And with that, the inspection continued. Admiral Calhoun moved on to the next workstation, asking routine questions about system status and readiness levels. But the atmosphere in operations had fundamentally changed. The casual dismissal of the morning had been replaced by something much more complicated. Respect, embarrassment, and the dawning understanding that assumptions can be dangerous things. Aaron returned to her checklist, pen moving across the page with the same steady rhythm that had marked her entire morning. But now, instead of being invisible, she had become something else entirely. Not a celebrity. She would have hated that. Just someone finally seen for who she really was. The printer beside her terminal whirred to life and ejected a single page. She pulled it free without hurry, folded it once with military precision, and tucked it under her arm. Then she stood, shouldered her worn bag, and walked toward the exit. She passed Hallie without a glance, walked by Dorsey as if he were part of the furniture, stepped around Rains like he was an obstacle in her path. There, but unimportant. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They just watched her go. 3 junior officers who had learned a lesson they'd carry for the rest of their careers. Near the exit, Ensign Collins stopped her with a quiet, "Ma'am?" She paused, looking at him with the same patient expression she'd worn all morning. "Just thank you," he said simply, "for fixing the system. For everything." Aaron studied his face for a moment, seeing something there that must have reminded her of herself at that age, eager, uncertain, trying to figure out how to be useful in a world that seemed infinitely complicated. "The job's not about being seen," she said quietly. "It's about making sure the mission succeeds. Everything else is just noise." She walked out into the morning sunshine, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at quiet competence the same way again. Later, much later, when the Admiral's inspection was complete and the daily routine had resumed its normal rhythm, Rains found himself standing next to Collins at the coffee machine. "Can I ask you something?" Rains said, his earlier confidence completely absent. Collins nodded. "How did you know? About her, I mean. You never said anything, but you were watching her work all morning like you suspected something." Collins was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Finally, he said, "My grandfather was Navy. Served on submarines during the Cold War. He used to tell me that the most dangerous person in any room was usually the one nobody noticed. Said the real professionals don't advertise their capabilities. They just do the job and go home." He paused, watching through the window as Aaron's truck disappeared down the base's main road. He also said that if you ever met someone who could fix impossible problems without breaking a sweat, you should pay attention, because people like that don't happen by accident. Rains nodded slowly, understanding something about respect that he'd never grasped before. Outside, the Virginia sun climbed higher into a clear sky. The base continued its daily routine. Aircraft launching and recovering, personnel moving between assignments, the endless cycle of preparation and execution that kept the Navy running. And somewhere in the administrative maze of Wing C, 3 junior officers began the long process of learning that true service doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just shows up, does the work, and disappears back into the background, invisible until the moment you need it most. That was her legacy, not the recognition or the respect or the moment of vindication in front of her tormentors, just the quiet knowledge that when systems failed and lives hung in the balance, someone would be there to fix what was broken. Someone who didn't need applause to know she mattered. Ever misjudged someone based on their title or their uniform? Ever dismissed someone as just anything? What would you do if an admiral walked in and revealed that the person you'd been ignoring was a decorated war hero? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this story made you think twice about quiet competence, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this with someone who believes that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. And remember, the most important people in your life might be the ones you've never really noticed. We'll see you in the next story right here at Dignity Defended.